this. With that, I'm really excited about tonight's webinar. It's going to be an important topic for everyone who recreates on U.S. Forest Service lands. They're basically transitioning to a new risk assessment guidance. So we're going to be right at the forefront as it's becoming unveiled and unrolled. We're going to be, Novak's presenting to you the information in real time. So hopefully we don't lose any access for projects or riding or events or volunteer work. So with that, I want to welcome Sandy Bearden. She is with the Forest Service in the Rocky Mountain region and has been at the forefront of developing this new risk assessments guidance. And she's going to tell us all about it and how things might change as we move forward, as we look to do our projects and volunteer work. So without further ado, I will let Sandy take over and she can talk to you all about this new guidance from the Forest Service. Sandy?
Hi, yes, well, thank you very much. I don't know that I'll be a tremendous speaker, but I'll try my best to cover the material and give you a broad understanding of the operational risk management process. The Forest Service, you know, in the wildland firefighting community, not just with the Forest Service, but with several other agencies, they have been using risk management for years. But it's just been in the last few years that they realized that we needed to develop tools and that we also needed to make this information available to all of our employees, our partners, our cooperators, just because it helps us take a better look at projects and looking at the risk associated with them so that we can mitigate risk more successfully. So tonight, I'm just going to cover broadly some of the common risk management terminology. We're going to talk about how and when to apply this process. There are 4 principles of, I call it ORM. So if I say ORM, it's operational risk management. So there's 4 principles and then the 5-step process. And then at the end, I'll show you the tools that we use to look at operational and real-time risk management. So like I said, the Forest Service back in 2017 developed an operational risk management guide. And then our branch chief for risk management gave his leaders intent in 2018 that we should educate our agency administrators, our line officers, our program managers about the process. And so they started putting together some curriculum. And we've slowly been rolling it out. We had a goal of educating a lot more people this year, but obviously with COVID, that kind of put a crimp in things. So I'm glad to share it with you all because we're trying to share this process with as many people as possible so that we are all on the same page. So we'll just jump right into it. And yes, if you have questions, I can't see the chat box from where I'm at, so just put them in there and we'll get to them at the end. So did you know, obviously, I hope that you do, that there's risk in everything we do. Risk taken to do our jobs, whether we look at it individually or collectively as a group. And some of the actions we take to control risk require very little thought. One of those examples would be putting on a seatbelt before we drive or ride in a vehicle. A lot of us do it instinctually, don't even think about it, but that single action can have such a significant impact in reducing the severity of an outcome to you or others, you know, in case of an accident. But also by employing an operational risk management process, we ensure that the actions taken by our employees on a daily basis result in the very best possible outcome. So we want to look at risk at every level of it. And just as a question, can you think of other instinctual actions we take to control risk? I spent many years in the military, and so anytime we would go out on the flight line, it was automatic that we'd put earplugs in and put our safety glasses on. And, you know, a lot of our operations have things that we do just instinctually. I'm sure, you know, safety gear and those sorts of things are applied without us really even thinking about it. But there are other instances where we really need to be thoughtful about the actions that we take to make sure that we're controlling risk. And, you know, as many of you probably know, these are examples of things that we do in the Forest Service, but I'm sure your groups probably have used chainsaws, understand about encounters with the public. You know, we're doing road and trail maintenance and riding specialized equipment like ATVs, UTVs, snowmobiles, and so on. So because of the nature of our work and the types of extreme field environments that we routinely work in, you know, we are challenged with exposure to risk on a daily basis. So we want to make sure that we're looking at that. So we'll just cover a couple of terms. There's a website that I actually think that you all can get to, and I did include the link in these slides. So if you want to share these after the presentation, they built a link that the public could get to look at all of these materials as well. So acceptable risk. That includes the residual and unidentified risks that we determine to be acceptable based on the importance of our objectives. We all have to accept some risk. I mean, let's go back to the example of riding in a car. You know, every time we get in a vehicle, we know that there's a risk that, you know, maybe the driver next to us isn't paying attention, they're texting, or they've been drinking, you know, so it's a risk that we take, but with our vehicles being safe, us wearing a seatbelt, us, you know, trying to use situational awareness, we're removing as much of the risk as we can, but there's still going to be some residual risk. An example that we use in our training is, you know, to maintain a high quality hiking trail, we're willing to accept that there may be occurrences of vandalism on or around the trail. And we're going to accept that risk because, you know, we want to have these hiking trails and keep them open as much as we can. Unacceptable risk is where that same trail may have an active fire. And so we can't allow people to be in there. And then after the fire, you know, there's going to be hazard trees, hazard snags that could injure employees or the public if they're out there hiking around. So we have to look at closures until we can remove those risks as much as possible, like bringing in, you know, chainsaw groups to cut down those snags or using mechanical equipment to remove them. So, you know, there's acceptable risk and then there's unacceptable, and we need to make sure that we're taking care of our employees and the public. And then, you know, this is what we're talking about tonight. We're talking about operational risk management. And it's, as you can see, it is a continuous, systematic process of identifying and controlling hazards to increase the certainty of our outcomes. You know, it involves identifying, assessing, decision making, implementing controls, and then supervising consistently to make sure that we're not missing anything. So we want to detect all the hazards and make sure that we're putting risk controls in place that effectively support our decision making. And you know, we use it here in the agency. We use it at the beginning of project planning. You know, we want to look at risk at the very beginning stages so that we're not surprised by something when we finally get out there to do the work. But we also use it for reviewing standard operating procedures, for, you know, looking at doing maintenance or even providing training. And we want to make sure that, you know, we're approving our risk decisions at the appropriate level. And we'll talk a little bit more about that further in. And then real-time risk management is when we're looking at risk in the moment. It's called an on-the-run mental or verbal review of the situation using that risk management process. And we don't necessarily document real-time risk management because you're out in the field doing the work at that moment. And so you have to make decisions on the fly that could affect you and your crew. And that's something that a lot of us do, again, instinctually, in our off-duty activities as well. You know, we think about how is this going to affect me? How is this going to affect my family? And we make decisions about it in the moment. So let's talk about the 4 principles. So the first one, and I feel like it's the most important one, is that we accept no unnecessary risk. Say we're getting ready to go out and do work, and we realize that, you know, there's some severe weather coming in for the day. You know, we don't need to even accept that risk. We can just postpone it, do it another day, and everybody's good. But some of the questions that you should ask yourself when thinking about this is, why is this risk necessary? And whose risk are we talking about? And, you know, pertaining to the work that we're getting ready to go do, what is a reasonable level of risk? So that to me is one of the #1 principles. But then we also need to accept risk when benefits outweigh the cost. You know, and the best example that I can provide for that is wildland firefighting, because we're looking at values at risk, people's homes, watersheds, um, historical structures, endangered species. So there are times that we place people in danger because the benefit of fighting that fire is going to outweigh the cost associated with it. And this is one of the areas where our agency really has to look at risk and the benefits versus cost. Okay, and the third principle is that we want to make risk decisions at the appropriate level. It's essential that our line officers or your program leaders, program managers make risk decisions where everyone clearly understands who's at the receiving end of this risk. If we're asking our employees to go do work, we need to make sure that they fully understand what the risk that they are accepting, and the line officer has to have a good conversation with them about what they're asking them to do. And then finally, we need to anticipate and manage risk by planning. So we need to start looking at risk in the beginning stages. When we're planning projects, say we're going to go build a bridge and use pack mules to haul everything in. You know, we need to start looking at that process at the very beginning stages, because there's a lot of things that could go wrong with that plan. So we need to make sure we're anticipating and managing it from the very beginning. Okay, let's look at the 5-step process now. So, you know, there are a ton of agencies that have started developing operational risk management, and there's some that have a 4-step process, some that have a 5-step, some that have 6 steps, but basically they're all the same. Some just break one step down into 2 different steps, but this is how we're going to do it. Step 1, we're going to identify the hazards. We need to have a clear understanding of the project and what the objectives of that project are. And then once the objectives are understood, we can begin the ORM process. And after identifying the hazards, we need to list the hazards that are associated with each phase of the project. So in talking about building a bridge, you know, we're talking about using a pack string. We're talking about how are we going to get our materials to the site where we would load them. And you know, there's just a whole host of things that we would need to look at. So we need to make sure that we're breaking it down specifically for each hazard, so that we can identify, you know, possible potential failures. And the main things that we ask our folks to look at are, you know, equipment, personnel, and then any other operational problems that could go wrong. And the key to successfully analyzing this risk like I said, is to carefully define the hazards and identify and evaluate safeguards. And one of the best ways to do that is to do a brainstorming session where you continually ask, what if? What if this happens? You know, what if one of our mules breaks a leg? What if we can't get all the materials in on the first load? You know, just what if it to death? And you'll eventually be able to look at every instance that needs to be identified and assessed. So then step 2, we're going to assess these hazards that we've identified and determine the level of risk that's associated with each of them. In this step, we only want to consider the risks that are applicable to meeting the objectives of this project. So to assess, and I'll show you later in our tools that go with this, to assess, we would evaluate the probability or likelihood that something would occur. And if it did, what would the severity and consequence of the effect of that event be? So first, begin by identifying the potential consequences and then determine the probability or likelihood based on past experience. And a lot of times we will call in subject matter experts because they've had the experience. And but on the other hand, a lot of times it's good to talk to the newest person to the crew and get their feelings about the probability or how they would view the severity, because it's all subjective based on experience and how many times you've done the task and so on. So we need to make sure that we're examining it from all levels. And then step 3, we're going to make risk decisions. And the decision must be made at the appropriate level by the individual who can balance the risk against the potential benefit and value. And this individual decides if the controls are sufficient and acceptable and whether to accept based on the resulting residual risk. And these risk decisions, like I said, should not be made in a silo, but they should be made in collaboration with all of the employees who would be impacted by these decisions. And again, ultimately, the acceptance of the residual risk is decided by the employees that are going to be exposed to the hazards. If they're not comfortable with the remaining risk, then there needs to be more conversation and dialogue about how we can maybe further assess these hazards and come up with even more mitigations. Or it may just be, like in the instance of wildland firefighting, that the agency administrator is going to say, I accept the risk. If you're willing to go do it, I'll sign off on it. But 9 times out of 10, we're going to have a deeper conversation. We're going to look at it even harder, and we're going to come up with some more risk decisions and mitigations. So step 4, after you get through those 3 steps, we're going to implement the controls. We're going to make sure that our employees have the equipment they need, the tools they need, that they feel comfortable, that they've had the training, and that they completely understand the controls that we're asking them to implement and the residual risk that's left over. And we're going to make sure that they're comfortable with that. And then step 5 is the final. I always call it supervise and review, because this, as you see, this is a continuous circle. And there may be times that we get to step 5 and we start the process and we realize, there are some things that we missed and we need to look further at it, or our mitigations aren't meeting our needs. And so it's a continuous circle where you step back and say, okay, we're going to look at this again, have a better conversation about it, and come up with some better ways to mitigate these risks and accept the residual risk. And as you can see in the center, the important pieces to remember about this is that we need to communicate, evaluate, and validate, and consistently. We need to continue to do that throughout the entire process. And so here on this slide is where I put the link for the operational risk management process that should take you all to the website. And I would encourage you all to go look there. There's just a wealth of information, tools, everything that you would need to just help you understand the process and how it works. Okay, so now we're going to just start looking at the tools. And here's the risk assessment worksheet. And this is what we would use to do that process, where we would identify the project that we're going to be working on. We would start looking at the tasks, break it down by each task, and then identify the hazards that are going to be associated with that task. And then this is where we assess the hazards and look at the likelihood or the probability, and then what would be the severity or the consequence. And our worksheet automatically generates the risk assessment code. And then, and you'll see in one of our other slides that I have one that's filled out, but it'll generate a risk assessment code. So then we want to look at our risk control options and come up with mitigations that are going to lower that risk assessment code. So you'll see as we go through the rest of these tools. So this is the risk assessment matrix tool, and this is where we look at the severity and the consequence or the probability or likelihood of something happening. So as we're looking at a hazard, and we say, you know, the chances of this occurring are moderate, or the severity or consequence of this happening, that would be moderate. And it's possible that it will occur, and so we would come up with a risk assessment code of moderate. But it's different. I mean, you could have something where the severity or consequence could be catastrophic, but the chances of it occurring would be rare. And so we'd still be in the moderate range. But if it's almost certain and it's going to be catastrophic, you know, we're going to be in that extremely high range. And that's where we're going to need somebody at the top to either accept it and sign off on it, or say, no, go back to the drawing table. Let's find a better way. Let's lower the risk and go that way. And this is our risk decision authority chart. I tried to add a column. I'm not sure how all of your cohorts or crews are lined out, or who your top leader would be, but you know, in the Forest Service, if the risk assessment code was extremely high, we're going to have a top U.S. Forest Service line officer, like someone from the Washington office, or a regional forester, or an agency administrator, who, for those of you that don't know, agency administrators are in charge of fire, and they make the decisions about that fire, or an incident commander. But for you all, it would have to be somebody high up in your chain of command that would sign off on that. For a risk assessment code of high, we still need a line officer, but it could be someone like a forest supervisor or a district ranger or a program manager. And the same for you all. You know, you could have a project leader sign off on it. For moderate, it's going to be, you know, the supervisor of the crew or the lead of your crew. And then if it's low, the individual can sign off on it themselves. And again, authorizing and accepting missions with a critical risk should be rare and not the norm. They can be accepted if the benefits outweigh the cost. We think about, in our agency, we think about that in terms of using aviation to help fight fire. You know, the consequences of something happening with an aircraft accident are catastrophic. And we've had those happen, but we rely on them so heavily and the work that they do to help us fight fire, that we're willing to accept that risk and continue to use them as a key tool. So here's the example of a completed risk assessment worksheet. And I'm sorry that it's so small, but I'll walk you through it. So this was done for an elk habitat survey after the Ross fire occurred up on the Leadville Ranger District in Colorado, if any of you are familiar with that area. But they needed to use snowmobiles to go out and do this survey. And so in looking at starting the process, the task is that they're going to be working in a remote area. And one of the hazards associated with that, obviously, is lack of communication. We have areas where our radios don't work, and we have areas where cell phones don't work. And so the probability of that happening is occasional, because we know we have known areas where we don't have um, tower communication. The significance of something happening, if it did, and we had say a severe injury and we needed to get that person out by calling for a life flight or something, if we don't have communication, then that severity is going to be significant. But as you can see, those two together still create a risk assessment code of minor. But we still want to get it down to the lowest possible level. So we look at our risk mitigations or abatement measures, and we decide that, okay, each employee is going to carry at least one radio and a spare battery. They're going to make sure they test that radio and the battery before they go out in the field, because we've had cases where that hasn't happened, and we had a bad outcome. We want to establish check-in and check-out procedures so that there are people back at the office that know, hey, this crew should be back at a certain time. And if we don't hear from them or they haven't checked in with us, then we know we need to start looking for them. And then before going out, study the radio coverage area and try to avoid those areas as much as possible. So after coming up with those mitigations, we see that the probability of something happening is rare. But if it does happen, the severity is still going to be significant. But that does drop the risk assessment code down to negligible, which helps us feel better about going out and doing this work and having these mitigations in place. And then we have to ask, is this work necessary? And yep, this survey was required to be done, and so yes, it is. And then the hazard controls are assigned to every person on the project. So every person that's going out to do this work or that's involved with it at all needs to be aware of this process and the documentation that we've done. And then you can look at the slide and go through and see some of the other areas that they've identified. Maneuvering snowmobiles through trees, rocks, and uneven terrain. The hazard is that we might have collisions with rocks or stumps, and the severity of that could be catastrophic. And so that creates a risk assessment code of serious. But then when we look at our mitigations, like wear a helmet and a goggle, maintain a safe speed, don't be out joyriding, and then have a sense of the terrain and try to take someone that's familiar with the area. And then that's going to drop your risk assessment code post mitigation down to minor, which makes everyone else feel more comfortable about going out and doing this work. So it looks complicated when you first see that sheet with all this stuff and colors, and but it's actually a really easy process to go through. And like I said, the worksheet, it is interactive. And so when you think about your hazard probability and your severity consequence, it creates that risk assessment code for you. And then that helps you determine how much mitigation you need to put in place to lower that risk assessment code. Yeah, and this is just another example of how we determine the probability, severity, and RAC code for the hazard assessment. So, if you're out riding a snowmobile, you're going to be exposed to cold and windy weather. And the hazards associated with that are fatigue, hypothermia, and frostbite. And so our risk assessment code that's generated ends up being serious. But when we look at our mitigations and say, hey, let's dress in layers so that we're ready for the conditions, wear proper clothing and boots, try to avoid becoming wet or overheated, and then just knowing the symptoms for hypothermia or frostbite can make you more aware, and you would address those issues immediately as opposed to waiting until it's too late and you're trying to get the person out of there. But as you can see, it drops the risk assessment code down to moderate, and the hazard control would be assigned to the district ranger. And again, we need to make sure everybody understands these mitigations and is aware of what the things that they can do to take care of themselves. And then when we assess the residual risk, we just want to make sure that we're looking at the signature block and asking who is this hazard control assigned to, and making sure that we're having the appropriate person sign off on this assessment, and that they're accepting the responsibility for the residual risk that's left over. So there's been some changes to the worksheet. They haven't uploaded the new one yet, but for the one we have now, an extremely high risk assessment code, like I said, would be someone from the Washington office or a regional forester or a project manager. If it's high, we're going to have the forest soup or the section or unit chief or the project manager sign off on it. If it's moderate, like I said, the district ranger, the crew lead, project supervisor can sign off on it. And then if it's low, the individual can sign off on it themselves. And this is what the end product looks like for a risk assessment sheet that's completely filled out. There's some really good examples on the website. And if you go and look at those and read through them, it really helps you understand the process and the thinking and how they got to the risk assessment codes that they came up with. And then the final tool is this risk assessment tool. And this is like a tailgate form, if any of you know what that is. It's when you get out to the project site and you have a review of the work that's going to be done that day, and you talk about everybody feeling comfortable. But we ask that these 6 elements be looked at and discussed before the work begins. And if there are concerns about any of these elements, there needs to be a greater dialogue around acceptable risk and then individual risk tolerance. I mean, when you look at environment, I used the example earlier. If you get out there and you see that there's a major thunderstorm rolling in, maybe it's time that you all just walk away from it. But, say duration, complexity, maybe you want to get out there and do the work in daylight, and you only have 6 hours by the time you get out there, and you realize, you know what, this is going to take us a lot longer than we thought. So someone may score that high. And any of these others too, there could be things that come up or that go wrong. I would just like you all to think about looking at this, what are some concerns that could cause a higher score? So this is the tool we want folks to look at. And this is also a good tool for the real-time risk management. When you're out there doing the work and then you start seeing that things aren't going as planned or things have changed, it's good to pull this out and look at it and say, you know what, team fitness, Joe called out sick today. We don't have everybody here that we need to get the work done in the right amount of time. So, maybe it's time that we reassess and possibly just come back at a different time and finish our work then. So that's the risk assessment tool. And then finally, I just wanted to share briefly I talked a little bit in the beginning about the timeline for implementation. So like I said, the Forest Service goal was to have all of our agency administrators trained by the end of this year. And we are rolling out a pretty aggressive training schedule starting in October to try and get that done, because we still have 600 folks that need this training. But we're also including supervisors and program managers in that training, so that they're getting the same training that our agency administrators are. And then the risk management staff is continuing to develop foundational risk management training that would be appropriate for all of our other employees. And we've been providing some training. Like I said, we had hoped to have this further along in the process, but because of COVID, it yeah, kind of slowed us down. So our training is going to continue in 2021. We can still use the job hazard analysis, and I know many of you know what that is and have used it. We are still using that. We have some forests that have completely transitioned to the risk assessment process and are no longer using JHAs, but we have others that just haven't been able to start that process yet. So we're still allowed to use the JHA, and it's a good tool. And you know, if you all use it, I would encourage you to continue to use it. But we just really feel like this risk process just encourages a broader conversation about addressing risk and providing for mitigations or abatements. And it just generates a more thorough thought process and discussion about risk decisions. So, you know, the goal is for us to eventually just go completely to the risk process, and eventually the JHA will go away. But for now, it's still good for you all to use it. I know we've had some volunteer groups that have been asked to do a risk assessment, and if you haven't had the training or don't understand how that works, then it's kind of hard for you to do it. So keep using those JHAs. But that is the end of my presentation. If you know, going forward, if you have any questions or anything you'd like to ask, or materials you'd like me to share with you, please feel free to reach out to me, and I'm happy to do that. But let's see if anybody has any questions.
Hey, Sandy, it's Dwayne. Thank you for that great presentation, and it's certainly some food for thought. And if anybody has any questions at this point, please feel free to type them in the chat box. We do have a little bit more discussion here. So maybe if some thoughts come in, you can ask some questions. But first, I want to say it's an interesting way of approaching risk, and it can be applied to all facets of our lives. And those of us in the OHV communities are very aware of risk and the efforts necessary to mitigate them. And so when you talk about putting the seatbelt on every time you get in the car, you know, it's Novak's ethic that we want to make sure everybody puts a helmet on every time they get into a side-by-side or throw a leg over an ATV or a dirt bike, along with the other safety gear. So it's really interesting to hear risk defined in this context, where you can actually apply this process to things you do with everyday life. And it's our sincere hope that OHV enthusiasts take that approach and follow that good lead that you provided.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, Dwayne, one of the biggest areas for injury in our agency is the use of specialized equipment like you know, ATVs, UTVs, and so we're happy about this process because it makes folks take a deeper look and really make sure that they have the skills and everything they need to reduce the risk to the lowest possible level.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's foundational for Novak. So we're certainly on board with that. I do have some questions that I hope you could talk through. And the first is just what prompted the Forest Service to decide to make this change, to move to the new process?
Well, like I said, you know, our wildland firefighters had started this process years ago using risk management, not to this degree and not with this material, but they used the risk process. And a lot of agency, I said I came from the military, and we had implemented risk management years ago, and it was just ingrained in us. And I think, our agency has really taken to heart the serious injuries and the fatalities that we've suffered. And we've taken a deeper look at what can we do better to remove as much of this risk as possible to protect our employees. And then, the fire community started using it. Well, then, the agency said, well, if they can use it, why can't the rest of us use it? I mean, our rec techs, our trail maintenance, our field going folks that aren't fire, they're exposed to just as much risk sometimes as our wildland firefighters are.
Absolutely. Thank you. And we've had a great discussion here about risk and the new process, but can we maybe spend a couple minutes, excuse me, talking about how this will be applied practically? If I'm an OHV enthusiast, when will I be necessary for me to fill out a form like this? Is it if we've got RTP funds and I'm helping build a bridge? Is it if we're going to have a club cleanup day? Will we have to do it if we're doing, a hare scramble or other event on Forest Service property? Just kind of help us understand exactly when this process will be in fact, be necessary for the folks on the phone.
Yeah, I don't have a good sense of that, Dwayne. I do believe that the hope is that once we, the Forest Service, completely move over to this process, that we would ask any of the groups that do work for us, work with us, help us get maintenance done out there in the forest, that we would want to share this procedure with you, or this process with you, so that you all, because we want to take care of you as well, because you're doing a lot of stuff for us. And so I'm thinking that once we completely switch over to this process, we're going to start asking you all to use this process. And it's not that you would necessarily, if you're just going to go out for one day and do a cleanup, it's not that you would need to do a full-blown risk assessment process. But if you're going to do a major project for us, then we want to make sure that you've looked at all the possibilities for risk and hazards just as much as we would. So I don't have a good sense of a time frame for that, but I would encourage you all to take a deeper look at this and start using the process now if you wish to.
Good. So is it a safe assumption to say that if you're currently involved in projects with the Forest Service that require you to fill out a JHA, you can anticipate that you'll be transitioning to this new risk assessment worksheet at some point? Or will the universe be bigger, meaning this will apply to even more? What do you have any sense of that?
Yes. So I do have I mean, it hasn't been put in writing yet, but I have been part of discussions where that is the goal, that once we switch to this process completely, that we would want you all to use this process as well, and just do away with the JHA. Not that you can't still use it, and actually the JHA is a good tailgate tool, like for when you're at the project site and getting ready to start the work. It's a good review, but we want everyone to take this deeper look and really look at the risks and assess the hazards and make sure that the proper mitigations are in place. I wish I had a better sense. Like I said, COVID has really messed up our timeline, so I'm not even sure of ours. But I know that we have been asking groups like yours to use the JHA. So it just goes that we would eventually ask you to use this operational risk management process.
Okay, I have one quick question for you, and then I'm going to turn it over to Mark. And this is sort of the $1 million question for us, and it's whenever we see, and when I say we, I'm talking about the OHV community. Whenever we see something new come along, we have a tendency to knee jerk be a little scared. And so I wonder if you could answer the question, just do you anticipate the rollout of this new risk assessment worksheet making it tougher or harder or less likely for events to be approved or projects to be approved or volunteer work to be approved?
No, actually, I think it will make it easier because we're going to see that you have looked at the project wholly, you know, and that you've looked at the different hazards and thought about them collectively and came up with better mitigations than say a JHA could come up with. So no, I don't see that happening at all, at all.
Excellent.
And you know, Dwayne, it's gonna. I do know that there have been instances where some of our volunteer groups have been asked to fill out a risk management worksheet, and obviously, if our folks aren't even trained on it, we can't ask you all to do that. But I'm thinking this is a couple years down the road before we fully have this implemented. So you're still good to continue using the JHA, but again, I would encourage you all to look at this process.
Excellent. Thank you. And I'll turn it over to Mark. I know he has some questions from the participants.
Okay.
Mark.
Okay, the first question we had from Dave was just about getting this link again where we can see the documents and the examples that you have. So this will be up on the screen. Towards the end, I will put it back to Sandy's contact info. But for now, if you didn't get that address where the example documents are, it's up on the screen right now. The next question from Ryan is, what is the status for current Forest Service volunteers and partners to do work? Not sure I understand. Okay.
I don't know the answer to that one.
We'll try and answer that for you, but I don't know if we have enough information. But Ryan, if you could send something to Mark or to Feist, actually, and we'll try and get that answered for you.
I will say this, if I can jump in real quick. I will say this. I do know that our agency is hoping to continue to build and grow relationships with our partners and our volunteers and our cooperators because we need your help to get our work done. So that's not going to go away. We're hoping to grow that.
Okay. The next question, what advice do you have for those of us leading projects which utilize volunteer workers with unknown capacities, personal risk factors, work skills, etc.? For us, it results in many projects not being open to volunteer workers.
Oh, yeah, that's a tough one. You know, I don't really know all the ins and outs of the volunteer program, but I do know we really need to look at the people that we're asking or that are coming out to do work for us. Again, the risk management process and that tool that I showed you at the end where you talk about crew fitness and you know, walking through that and making sure that everybody is completely capable of doing the work that we're asking them to do is very important. But you know, the Forest Service is pretty limited on how we can direct you all to do that. That's an agreement that you sign and then, you know, you go out and do the work and everything goes well and we're happy. But you know, sometimes something doesn't go well and then we have to step in and be responsible for, you know, maybe workman's comp or things like that. But that's a tough question, and that's not that's not really my area of expertise. I'm not the volunteer coordinator for our region, but I would just be mindful of the folks that are volunteering to come out and do the work, you know, the more capable they are of doing it, the better it is for all of us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's probably not a very good answer, but that's, again, not my area of expertise.
Okay. We had some clarification from Ryan. His earlier question was regarding volunteer partners not being able to do anything with the Forest Service because of COVID in the region he's in. In that area, BLM and CPW are allowing volunteers. Is there a risk assessment for COVID that would allow volunteers?
You know, I don't know. I would have to do some research on that. Gosh, I would think there would be. But as far as I know, we still, in my region, we're still allowing volunteers and, you know, partners to do work for us, obviously following COVID guidance. But let me look for that, and if I find one, I'll share it with you all.
That'd be great. And I know Novak has one that one of our board members put together that we can send with you, Ryan. Share with you if you'd be interested. Next question, can we examine existing real world ORM documents for a specific type of equipment or specific activities?
We have built risk assessments that we maintain in our libraries. I don't think the public can get to them, but if you sent me a request for, say, ATV use or trail maintenance, you know, I could pull those out and share them with you just to give you a starting point.
Okay. Here's Sandy's contact info again, everybody. So if a group of dirt bikers know some blowdown occurred in a local trail system and want to clear it out over the weekend with chainsaws, what would they need to do that? What's the process there?
Well, if they want to do it just on their own accord, or if they want to work with us to do it.
My expectation is they want to know who they would contact, how they would get the information, what forms would they need to be filled out. And,
Okay.
you know, I think there's always, whenever there's anything new that comes out like this, there's, you know, a fear that the process has changed.
No, and it hasn't. Yeah, they would still contact the local line officer, which would be the district ranger for whatever area that is, and work the process like they've always done.
Okay. With that, we're closing in on an hour here. Sandy, we really want to thank you for your time, and thank you for being willing to share your contact information and also offer to follow up with a few things. And you can get that to Mark or me or Laura or anybody, and we'll share it out. I hope this can be an ongoing conversation. You weren't put in the fairest of spots here because with the way things are going, it's a little unclear how the Forest Service can even proceed given the current realities. And also, I think you know, the bottom-up nature of the Forest Service makes it difficult too, because we hear all the time that an enthusiast in California on a forest has a entirely different process than somebody on a forest in Alabama or something like that.
Right. Yeah.
So I think that makes your job a little harder to be definitive. So we appreciate you being willing to come on and have this conversation with us. I hope it makes people think. I hope it makes people understand that, you know, change is coming. And I hope that, you know, the change is for the better, meaning not only do we not see less projects or on Forest Service land, but that we see safer projects, which should be everybody's goal and is certainly Novak's goal.
Right.
With that, I just say thank you one more time. We were delighted to have you. The other information I want to give is this webinar has been recorded and it will be posted on our website in the next few days. So if you need to share it around or if you want to review something, you'll be able to get to it. Also like to announce we are continuing our webinar series next month. We are going to have what we think will be a popular webinar. We're going to get some assistance on helping enthusiasts understand how to write good grants, meaning how they can put the best information in the grant form to ensure success. And we're going to have Nikhil from out at the Nevada OHV Commission help us with that. And I think it'll be a good one. So with that, one final thank you to Sandy, and hope everybody is staying safe, but still finding some time to get outside and particularly get out on a OHV and have some safe and responsible fun. So thank you, everyone. Stay tuned to Novak's website and your emails, and we'll let you know about our upcoming events. Thank you.